Hey everyone, my name is Jess and I'm the designer behind Sallie Tomato. Join me to create the Tiffany bag. This bag features cork fabric, hardware, and has a unique classic shape. In this video, I'll take you step by step to make the entire project. I've also included tips on how to sew with knit fabric and some bonus hardware hacks that aren't included in the pattern and are only available in this video class. You'll learn how to prepare cork fabric handles and a crossbody strap, how to attach a slip pocket, how to attach unique hardware such as purse feet, strap arches, and metal handles, how to attach a double slide zipper. I'll also take you step by step to learn how to install a drop-in lining. I love this method of construction because it avoids bias binding and it looks super professional when it's done. Included in this online class is the full video tutorial. The pattern and your supplies will need to be purchased separately. Grab your supplies and let's get started. For my Tiffany bag, I'm using this gorgeous soft leopard knit fabric that I got from So English, and I'm using Sallie Tomato natural cork fabric for the contrast fabric. So to prepare my fabric for attaching it to the foam, since this is a knit, normally you don't use knit for making bags, but I loved this print and it is so soft. So what I did was I fused a layer of Bozal hair canvas to the back, and this type of interfacing is a medium weight fusible interfacing, and it's really great for tailoring, handbags, anything that you want really nice structure to. And I'm really pleased with how it feels on the knit because the knit is still soft. It has a little bit of stretch to it, but it really reduced the stretch, which is what we want for bag making. We don't want something to stretch. And also, if you crumple it up and you turn your bag right side out, there's absolutely no wrinkles since we're using this knit fabric. So it holds its shape really well. It's super soft. And I think this is my new favorite fabric for bag making, especially because it doesn't wrinkle. So after you have all your pieces cut out, the first step in the instructions is to attach the foam to the coordinating pieces. So I've already matched up all of the foam pieces, and we're going to start with the exterior front and back, and then the contrast bottom panel. So you're just going to have the right side of your fabric up, and you're going to layer the exterior front on top of the foam and align all edges. And sometimes if you have a piece of foam that's a little bit bigger, like for this piece here, I just roughly cut around the size that I'm making, and I can trim that off later. Because what we're going to do is we're going to top stitch the fabric to the foam. We're going to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance around all the edges. And for the knit fabric and the foam, you can use a basting spray to hold these together, or you can use pins, wonder clips. But for the cork fabric, you definitely want to use wonder clips or that adhesive spray to hold them together. So we're going to start by top stitching with a 1/4 inch all the way around. And you can lengthen your stitch length so it's a little bit longer. The point of this step is to just attach the fabric to the foam, so having a little bit longer of a stitch length helps it go a little bit faster. So here's what our pieces look like, top stitched to the foam. And I'm just going to take my scissors and trim this excess foam even with the fabric. And then you can set those pieces aside. And now we're going to repeat the same process for the 4 exterior upper side panels. And then we have an upper side panel foam piece that's larger. So basically you're just going to equally space all of the upper side panels on the piece of foam, And you're going to top stitch around each one with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And lastly, you'll do the same with the contrast lower panels. So this will be out of the cork fabric, and you'll equally space them on the foam and top stitch them in place with a 1/4 inch seam allowance as well. So then, just as before, we're going to trim the foam even with the side edges of the fabric. And then you can set these pieces aside for now. And here's what your upper side panel pieces will look like, and you can set these aside as well. The next step is to prepare the slip pocket for the outer pocket on your bag. And you'll have this big piece that's 18.5 inches long and 10 3/4 inches wide. And I fused the hair canvas to this piece as well, so that way it had more structure to it. And you're simply going to fold the slip pocket in half with wrong sides together. So now it should be 9 1/4 inches high. And you can take this over to your ironing board and give it a good press along that top folded edge. Make sure all your sides are even and aligned. I'm just going to add a couple pins. And then you'll take this over to your sewing machine and top stitch along that folded edge with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Whenever I do top stitching, I change my stitch length to 3. It's nice to have a little bit longer of a top stitch, so that way it looks a little bit more decorative and professional. And it's always a good idea to back stitch. And that's it for the slip pocket. You can set this piece aside for later. Included in the pattern are instructions to make handles for the front and the back of your bag out of your contrast fabric. And it's optional to add strap arches on each side of those handles. So I'll show you in a minute how to make the handles out of your cork fabric, but then you can also add an arch to each side for a little bit more embellishment. If you want to get creative with your bag, there's some really unique hardware out there, and the instructions for this hardware are not included in the pattern for placement, but I'm including them in this video as a bonus to you. So there are 2 different styles of metal handles that are available on our website. There's the arch handles and the round handles. And you'll receive a set of 2. So you'll have one for the front of your bag and the back of your bag if you decide to choose one of those options instead of doing what's included in the pattern. So this type of hardware looks super professional, and it's very easy to install. To give you an idea of how to install it, you'll take one piece of your bag, so this is the front of my bag, and you'll measure down 2 3/4 inches from the top edge with your ruler, and then just mark across. And then you'll also mark the center. So I'm just going to fold it in half, and I'm going to mark the center. So let's say we're going to install the round handles. So you're going to need to unscrew the screws on the back side of the hardware, and they're very small, so just be careful that you don't misplace them. And unscrewing the screws will remove this back plate. And we're going to use this as a template for marking the screw holes. So you'll center this on that 2 3/4 inch line, and you'll mark those 2 screw holes on your fabric. And you can use a seam ripper to cut these 2 holes, or you could use a rotary punch. I personally like to use a rotary punch because it has a nice clean cut, and then it's really easy to screw the screws back in place through my material. So I'm just gonna do this as an example. Since I'm not gonna actually poke the holes through my fabric, I am gonna do the cork fabric handle option. So you'll poke those holes through, and you'll put this piece back on the hardware, on the handle part, and you'll end up poking those prongs through the holes that you poked through. Look how pretty that looks. And then you'll flip it over to the wrong side, and you'll place your washer over those holes that you punched, and then you'll just simply screw the hardware in place. Super easy, very strong, and super professional looking. So you do that to the front and the back of your bag. For the other handle option, it's important to note that there are 2 different types of pieces per handle. So this is the arch piece, this is the handle piece, and then you have 2 connectors, and this will connect the hardware to your bag. So we already have that 2 3/4 inch line marked, and we have our center point. So you'll do the same exact thing if you're installing this type of hardware. And I've already measured the distance between the center of each hole on the handle, and it's 4 1/4 inches. So we're gonna measure out 2 1/8 inches from the center along that horizontal line and make a mark. So then you'll take your screwdriver and unscrew the back plate from each of the connectors. And you'll use that back plate as a template and center the top hole on each of those 2 1/8 inch marks. So you'll do the same for this one and put it over here. You'll take your pencil and mark both of the screw holes and punch those screw holes or cut them with your seam ripper. Then you'll place the connector through the hole on the handle on one side, and you'll place it over those holes that you punched. And you'll do the same for the opposite side. Then you'll flip the hardware over and the project over. And just like before, you're gonna add this back plate over the holes that you punched, and then you'll screw the screws in place to secure the hardware. And again, you do the same to attach the other side. So that'll kind of give you an idea of what this version of handle will look like on the bag. Super pretty, very classy, and very unique as well. So those are some great options if you choose to use hardware instead of making your own handles. But I'm going to show you how to make the handles. So first we're going to prepare our cork fabric handles. You can set the hardware aside. So you're going to have the wrong side face up, and you're going to fold each of the length side edges to the center. And you'll do this for the entire length of the strap. And you'll notice that the cork fabric just wants to bounce back. It is a thicker material and it has a great body to it, but it doesn't like to be folded. So either you could use some wonder clips to hold this in place, or I like to use Clover double-sided basting tape. This is the strongest tape that I have found that will hold cork fabric, and you can sew through it and it won't gum up your needle. So if you choose to use this option, you'll just peel the tape off and place it down the center of the handle and just press it down to adhere it, and take your scissors and just trim off that access piece. And then you'll just peel off the paper side to expose the other side of the tape. And now when we fold the edges to the center and press down, it's not going anywhere. So I love using this tape when I'm sewing with cork fabric. It comes in handy for a variety of applications. So you'll do this for the entire length of both handle pieces. And then you'll take this to your sewing machine and you can top stitch from the right side with a 1/4 inch seam allowance along both length side edges. So I've already sewn my top stitching on both of my handles, and next I'm going to show you how to taper the ends. So this will add a little bit of shape and decoration to the ends of each of the handles. So first you're going to measure down a 1/2 inch from each of the short ends and mark across. And I'm actually going to flip this over to the wrong side and mark on the wrong side, so that way I don't have to worry about removing my markings later on. Okay. So then you're going to take your ruler and connect the center with the edge of your 1/2 inch line that you made to make a diagonal line, and you'll do that for both sides on each handle. And you can mark this or you can just directly cut it if you would like. So then you're going to take your scissors and cut along each of the diagonal lines to taper the ends. So that's what it'll look like. Very easy. And then you'll do the same thing to the opposite end of each handle piece. And one of the things I love about cork fabric is you can leave the edges raw. So that's why we're able to do this with the handles, since we don't have to worry about these edges fraying later on. And the same thing with the center of the handle. They're just top stitched together and you don't have to worry about them unraveling. Also, it will be very soft and lightweight to carry the handles. And that's it. You can set those aside for now. Next, we're going to attach the slip pocket. So take your exterior front with the foam attached and take your slip pocket that we prepared earlier, and you're going to have both pieces right side up, and make sure that the width is the 10 3/4 on both pieces. So you're going to line up the bottom and side edges of the pocket with the front, and you can use some pins or wonder clips around the edges. I'm going to take some wonder clips. I love using wonder clips for bag making since it'll hold all those layers together. And then the clips also help compress the foam, so as you sew, it'll be a little bit easier to sew through. Then you'll take this over to the sewing machine and top stitch the pocket in place with a 1/4 inch seam allowance on the sides and the bottom edge. Now we're ready to attach some hardware. If you don't want to add strap arches to your bag, you can skip this section of the video completely. Now would be the time if you wanted to add those round handles or arch handles like I talked about before. But I'm going to stick with the strap arches and my cork handles that I made earlier. So we're first going to mark the placement for the strap arches and the handles. First, you're going to measure in 2.5 inches from each of the side edges and mark a vertical line. Then you're going to measure up from the bottom 5.5 inches and also 8.5 inches. And you're going to mark 2 horizontal lines. And you can choose to mark them all the way across. It's a little bit easier of a visual, or it's most important to just mark them along that vertical line that you made, so then you have an intersecting point. So our goal is to install the strap arches on either side of the bag like this, and our handles are going to go through the arch opening. So these are just meant to be decorative, and they also help hold your handle up straight too. So you'll want to make sure that the prongs are straight. Sometimes they get bent outwards a little bit. You can set those aside. And included with each strap arch is a washer. And this not only holds the hardware in place, but we're going to use it as a template for our prongs. So take one of the arches and test it to see which holes the prongs poked through. So my prongs poke through the second hole in on each side. Sometimes, depending on what the factory sends us, there are different washers. So you might have different size washers, but they'll all work for the hardware. So you're gonna place that washer on the 8.5 inch line that we marked earlier, and then my prong poked through the second hole on each side. So I'm gonna place that second hole along the vertical line, but then I'm also gonna mark the second hole on the left side. This will help us cut the slits for the prongs. And you'll do the same on the other side. Now, when I've taught this bag in classes, some students wanted to have their strap arches spaced a little farther apart. So if you test this on your bag right now before we cut the slits, that prong is going to poke through on the vertical line along the horizontal line on each side. So that gives you an idea of how big of an opening in between the hardware you'll have for putting things in. Normally this pocket is handy for putting a magazine or sunglasses or your cell phone. So if need be, you can move the hardware according to where you want it positioned. Too far apart, the handle won't look quite right, so you might have to make a longer handle. But I'd say if you'd center the hardware on the vertical lines, then you'd have a larger opening and your handle will still look like how it does on the pattern. You don't want to go too close to the edge. I'd make sure that you stay at least 1 inch or 1.5 inches away from each of the side edges, because you have to account for seam allowance later on, and you want to make sure that hardware is enough out of the way. But I'm going to install my hardware exactly how the pattern is. So after you have your prongs marked, then you're going to use a seam ripper and cut a slit through all the layers where each of the prongs are going to poke through. And start small with your slits. You can always make your slit bigger, but you want to make sure that your hardware has a nice tight fit. You don't want it to be loose at all. And one other tip, if you're afraid of cutting your fabric and going too far, you could take a pin and put it on the top of where your slit will be. And then as you poke through with your seam ripper and push up, it will stop at that pin and it won't cut any further. So you can use that as a precaution if you'd like. Then you're going to take your hardware, poke it through the slits that you cut. And you'll flip it over to the wrong side. Place the washer over the prongs, and then bend the prongs away from the center. And if you'd like, you could take a scrap of that fusible interfacing from before and iron it over the back side of your hardware, and that will help prevent your bag from being scratched from the hardware at all. And then you'll do the same for the remaining arch on the front of the bag, and then you'll install 2 strap arches on the back side of your bag as well. And then we're ready to move on to the next step. After you have your strap arches installed and all your markings on each half of the bag, we're going to start with one side of the bag and attach one of our handles that we made earlier. So take one of your cork fabric handles and have the right side face up of your fabric and your handle, and you're going to feed each end of the handle through one of the strap arches. And the point end of the handle will be in line with that 5.5 inch mark, and then the side edge of your handle will be even with the 2.5 inch mark. So that'll help be a guide to make sure that your end of your handle is straight. And you'll do the same for the opposite side. Now, since we can't use pins on cork fabric, either you can hold this in place as you sew. Otherwise, you could use some of that double-sided basting tape that I showed you earlier. You can adhere it to the center back and just stick it in place. Or you could even try sewing with some paper tape. And so this tape you can sew right through, so you can position your handle and then just tape it in place. And you can sew right over the paper tape and it will tear off after you're done sewing. So I'm going to do the paper tape option, and you're going to top stitch each end of your handle in place. And you're going to sew starting at the hardware. Have your presser foot as far back as you can, and you're going to sew with an 1/8 inch seam allowance down the side, along the tapered end, back up the side, and you'll stop sewing where you started and sew across the handle. If you did not add any strap arches, you'll start at the 8.5 inch line with an 1/8 inch seam allowance and sew down the side, taper end, back up to the 8.5 inch line and sew across. So a little bit different depending on if you chose to use the hardware or not. And you'll do this for each side of the bag. So I've switched over to the narrow foot on my machine, and this will help me keep an even 1/8 inch seam allowance for my top stitching. You could also use a zipper foot. So either of those I recommend for top stitching the end of the handles. And it's tempting to sew across the very top edge and right close to the hardware. However, when you get to the edge, the side edge, and you go to pivot, you're going to hit the hardware and you aren't going to be able to sew that. So I recommend to start as far back as your presser foot will allow on the right hand side of the handle. And then you'll back stitch and sew down the side. And then you'll come up the opposite side and you'll stop stitching across from where you started and then sew across the handle there. And then you'll repeat for the opposite side. We can take our paper off, and you repeat the same steps to attach the handle to the front of your bag. Next, I'm going to show you how to make and attach the strap connectors. The strap connectors will have the D-rings on them, and this piece will allow us to clip our crossbody strap to our bag. So I've already marked the center of the strap connector, and then what you're going to do is you're going to fold each of the longer edges to that center line, and you'll top stitch each edge with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So you can add some pins or clip it in place, but I'm just going to hold it as I sew and use a stiletto to help hold it in place and sew my 1/4 inch seam allowance. So here's what it'll look like when it's done with the top stitching on both sides. Next, you're going to take your strap and fold it in half, matching the short ends. And you're going to cut along the fold to create 2 strap connector pieces. So you'll have 1 connector for each D-ring. So take one of the connectors and slide the D-ring over one of the connectors so that way the flat side is against the wrong side of your fabric. And fold each of the short ends so they meet in the middle on the back side. And then just pin it in place. And I usually pin both of the folds in place to keep them from shifting. And you'll do the same for the remaining connector and D-ring. So then you're going to take both of your upper side panel B pieces. So this is the piece that has the curve on the right hand side. You also have 2 that are A's, and we'll set those ones aside for later. So we need to transfer the placement of the strap connector from the pattern piece onto each of the upper side panel B pieces. So there's a variety of ways that you could do this. Usually what I like to do is place it against the right side of your fabric and align all the edges, and take a pin or your stiletto and poke it through one of the corners of the placement box, and then just fold away the pattern piece and mark where the pin pokes through on your fabric. So that'll be the upper left hand corner, and then we'll mark the upper right hand corner. And then the same for the bottom 2 corners. So then you have all your corner points marked, and then you can just line up the corner points of the connector. Otherwise, if it's a little bit easier for you, you could cut this out with a pair of scissors, and then you have the entire rectangle that you can mark. So you'll remove that center piece of paper, you'll cut it out, and then you can just trace the inside of the strap connector placement box. So either way, whichever's easiest for you. And after you have your placement marked, then you're going to take one of your connectors and center it in between the placement marks. And you can re-pin it in place, or you could use some of that paper tape from before to tape it down. And we're going to top stitch across the connector starting next to the hardware. So since this hardware is nice and flat, we can sew across the top edge first, probably about 1/4 of an inch or 3/8 of an inch from that top fold, just enough so you don't hit the hardware. And then you can pivot, sew down the side, across the bottom, and back up the other side. If you'd like, you could also do an X in the middle for reinforcement. It's up to you. And again, a zipper foot really helps with this step, or a narrow foot, so you can stitch nice and close to the hardware and the edges. And then you'll repeat to attach the opposite connector to the other side. Position your exterior front so it is right sides up and the handle is towards the top. Take one of your exterior upper panel A pieces. So this piece has the curve on the left hand side. You're going to flip it so the front and the panel are right sides together. You're going to align this straight edge, this long straight edge along the top straight edge of your front. And then you're also going to align that curved edge along the side edge. So you can add a clip to hold that corner here. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be sewing just a little bit to attach the upper side panel piece to the front. Also, you'll want to take your pattern piece, and it can be either pattern piece because the indication on the pattern is the same. There is a placement called the Start Stop sewing line. So you're going to want to transfer that mark to all 4 of your upper side panel pieces. So you can do that before you attach them. And I'm just going to take a pen and mark. And that'll tell me where to start or stop sewing. So in this instance, we're going to start on the top edge and sew down. And as you sew, you're going to want to slightly curve the panel so that way the edges stay even on the side, and you'll stop sewing at that mark. And you're going to sew with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. And make sure to backstitch when you start sewing. And make sure this curved edge stays even with the side edge of the front. And backstitch once you reach that placement line that we marked earlier. So you'll want to finger press that seam open. And this is what it'll look like pressed away. So we have one panel attached. Now we're going to take one of our panel B pieces that has the connector with the D ring attached to it. And we're going to repeat the same process but for the opposite side. So you're going to place it right sides together. I've already marked the Start Stop sewing line on the back side. You'll line up those top edges. And this time, since we're going to be putting it in the sewing machine like this, we'll need to start at that line and sew up to the top edge. So in order to do that, I'm going to pin in place, and then I'm going to slightly curve it and add a few more pins. And that way I make sure that I maintain the shape of the bag that I want. And I'm even going to put a pin in beyond that line just to make sure that everything stays even. So then we're going to start sewing at the line and sew up to the top of the bag with 3/8 inch seam allowance. So again, you'll finger press that seam open, and then you'll fold it away from the bag. So here's what our bag looks like so far, and you're going to repeat the same process for the back side of the bag with the remaining upper A panel and upper B panel going on those same coordinating sides. Now I'm going to show you how to prepare a zipper if you're using Zipper by the Yard. For this project, you need a 26-inch or longer zipper. What's great about using Zipper by the Yard is you can cut any length of zipper that you need. So whenever you buy Sallie tomato zippers by the Yard, they have a nylon coil with a metallic finish, so they look like metal teeth, but they're not. So you can cut and sew directly over the zipper tape and the coil. The pulls themselves are metal, so you'll still have to watch out for when you're sewing to make sure they stay out of the way. When you first open the package of zippers, there's fabric on each end of the zipper tape, and this fabric will help you get the pulls on. I've already been using this zipper tape, so I have a raw edge, and I've already gone ahead and stitched over the coil so that way my zipper won't come off when I put it on the tape. So that's the opposite end. So my advice is to always save one end for putting the pulls on, and then you zip all the zippers down to the other end and you do your cutting from this end. So that way you always have that fabric to help you get the pulls on. If you accidentally cut this off and you're working with a raw end of zipper tape, then I have tutorials on YouTube how to easily put the pulls on. It's just as easy, but sometimes it takes a little bit of practice. So definitely check that out if you're using raw zipper tape for Zipper by the Yard. So we're going to make a double slide zipper for our project. So if you look at the zipper pull, this is the right side of the zipper pull, and if you flip it over, that's the wrong side. So the pull is flat, and the right side has the pull tab. So you're going to have the right side up, and then if you look at the zipper tape, you'll see the coil, and that is the right side of the zipper. The wrong side has the stitches on the back. So make sure you have the right side of the tape and the right side of the pull face up. Now, we're going to start by putting on the pull that has to go backwards first. So if you look at the pull, there's a flat end with only one opening and a rounded end that has two openings. And since we're going to be putting on the zipper pull that goes backwards first, it has one opening, so we're going to leave our coil together just like it is. And you're going to place both of the fabric ends through that single opening of the zipper pull, and you'll push it onto the tape and you'll feel it stop and it won't go any further. Then you just take both sides of the tape and you pull, and this pull slides right on. So you can move that down out of the way for now. Now we're going to attach the pull that will meet in the middle with the other zipper pull. So this time we're going to use the rounded end that has two openings, which is perfect because now we have two sides of our zipper chain. So you're going to put one side through each hole and just leave the pull on the fabric end for now. Don't put it on the zipper yet. And make sure that your fabric ends are aligned so that way you know your coil is even. And then you're just going to zip up the zipper. And that's how easy it is to put your zipper pulls on your tape. So now, like I mentioned before, we're going to zip these pulls all the way down to the opposite end. And from this end, we're going to cut the length that we need. So that way our other end is preserved for next time we need to put zipper pulls on. So I'm going to take my ruler and mark 26 inches. And I'm using a shorter ruler, so I'm going to have to measure a few times. So here's where our 26 inches comes to. And you're going to take this over to the sewing machine and you're going to sew an 1/8 inch on both sides of the marked line. And this will create a zipper stop for our current zipper that we're making, and then the other 1/8 inch mark on this side of the line will create a zipper stop for the next time we make a zipper. After sewing, we're going to cut on the marked line. So take this over to your sewing machine and just sew slow. Since it is plastic, you can sew over it. And after we sew those two lines, we're going to cut down the center along that marked line to separate our zipper from the rest of our zipper tape. Since this is a nylon coil, like I mentioned, you can sew directly over the teeth, but you never know when you're going to break a needle, so just sit back and make sure that you sew slowly. So now our double slide zipper is ready to install into our project. The pattern calls for a 26 inch or longer double slide zipper, and that is longer than the top edge of our bag for a reason. So you can zip your pulls all the way to one end and make sure that they're closed, and you're going to place your zipper right sides together with the front of your bag. Our zipper is longer so that way your pulls can extend past your fabric. So that way when you're sewing your zipper in place, you don't have to worry about your pulls getting in the way. So make sure that your handle is folded down out of the way. And as you see on the other side, we just have a little bit of zipper tape hanging over the edge. So you're going to top stitch the zipper in place along this top raw edge with 3/8 inch seam allowance. So just make sure your handle stays down out of the way, and that way your pulls are off the edge. A zipper foot or a narrow foot will help for this step. Make sure that those seams attaching the upper side panels are pressed open when you sew over them. zipper down. Now you're going to press the zipper up towards the top of the bag and press the seam towards the bottom of the bag. So this is what it'll look like on the wrong side. Make sure that your seam isn't pressed up. You want it pressed down. And we're going to top stitch 1/4 inch away from the zipper. And again, whenever I do top stitching, I like to lengthen my stitch length to about 3 millimeters so it looks a little bit more decorative and it matches consistent with the rest of my top stitching. So here is what our bag is looking like so far. Super cute. I love how it's turning out. So now we're going to attach the back side of our bag to the opposite side of the zipper. And it's going to be the exact same steps as before. This time, you're going to place your back of your bag right sides together with the front. And make sure that you press those seams open and that your seams line up and will be across from each other. So I'm going to have to scoot that down a little bit. And you can check from the wrong side too to see if your seams line up. And then you'll also want to make sure that the bottom edges of the side panels are even. So you can continue clipping, making sure that the zipper tape is even with that raw edge of the back. And then you'll sew together with 3/8 inch seam allowance across the top edge and do your top stitching with a 1/4 inch seam allowance just like before. So this is the part of the class where everybody starts to get excited because they can see all these weird shaped pieces coming together and making a bag. So I hope you're getting excited as I am. Next, we're going to zip the zipper pulls to the center. And then we can trim off that excess zipper tape. So that way it's even with the side edges. And if you're uncomfortable about having that raw end there without any stitches in it, you could definitely stitch across. But as long as you don't move these zipper pulls, you'll be fine because we're going to sew across it right away in the next step. And I'm just going to trim off some of this extra fabric too because for whatever reason, this side of the bag was a little bit longer than the other. Sometimes that happens if you're stretching or pulling as you sew. So I just had a little tad bit extra I cut off so that way the edges are even. And now we're ready to move on to attaching the lower side panels. Take one of your lower side panels and you'll notice that there's a straight edge and then a curved bottom edge. So we're going to take this top straight edge, turn the lower side panel right sides together with our fabric and align that straight edge with the bottom edge of our upper side panels. So make sure that the side edges are even as well and clip it in place. And repeat for the opposite side. And you're going to sew this together with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance for both of the lower side panels. And I like to backstitch over the zipper just for reinforcement. Now you're going to take your scissors and trim away as much foam as possible from both sides of the seam. Just be careful not to cut through the cork fabric or your zipper tape. It's okay if you cut through some of the main fabric. Then you're going to fold the lower panel down away from the zipper. On the back side, just make sure that the zipper tape stays flat and the cork fabric seam is face down. And you're going to top stitch on the cork with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So this is what it'll look like, and you'll repeat for the opposite side. Next, I'm going to show you how to install purse feet on the contrast bottom panel of your bag. Purse feet are optional, but they help add a little bit of support and stability to your bag and also help protect the bottom of your bag from getting dirty because they lift it off of the table or wherever you set it down just a little bit to help prevent it getting dirty and scuffed. So if you want to install purse feet, first step is to mark the placement. So flip your project over to the wrong side and we're going to measure in 1.5 inches from all 4 edges. Where each of the lines intersect is where you're going to put a purse foot. And you can cut a slit with your seam ripper like we did earlier for the strap arches, or I like to use a rotary punch to make the holes for the purse feet. So I have mine set about 1/8 inch diameter, and I'm just going to punch a hole at each of the intersections. And as you can see, it made a clean cut all the way through the foam and the cork. So then take one of your purse feet and you're going to poke the prong through the hole. And then on the wrong side, you'll take a washer. And this is just a universal washer, so you'll notice that there's a hole in the middle and 2 slits. So this piece of hardware is also used for other hardware installation. For the purse feet, you're just going to use the center hole. You don't need those slits on the sides. So put the foot through the hole and then separate each of the prongs. And what I like to do is add a drop of permanent glue on the back side of each of the purse feet, and that'll help secure them in place. And also iron a scrap of interfacing over the back side of each of the purse feet to help protect the inside of your bag. The next step is to attach the bottom panel to the front of the exterior. So you're going to place your fabrics right sides together, and you're going to align one of the long edges of the bottom panel along the bottom raw edge of the front panel. So make sure the side edges are even as well and clip the layers together. Then you'll take this over to your sewing machine and sew together with 3/8 inch seam allowance. After sewing together, trim away as much foam from the seam allowance as you can to help reduce bulk. Then you're going to fold the bottom panel away from the front and you're going to press the seam so it's towards the front. So that way the cork fabric lays flat. Then you're going to top stitch on the front 1/4 inch from the seam. Here's what it'll look like after top stitching. Then you're going to attach the opposite raw edge to the bottom edge of the back panel. So you're just going to place them right sides together and you're creating like a loop for your bag, attaching the other side. So you'll repeat the same process with 3/8 inch seam allowance and 1/4 inch top stitching. One tip to do the top stitching, since this is now a loop, is to unzip the zipper pulls all the way. And then you're going to put this underneath the needle of your sewing machine and you can sew right along the back edge to do your top stitching with the zipper open wide. Make sure that your zipper pulls are about 3 inches apart from each other. So zip them up to about the middle, but leave them open just a little bit for turning the bag right side out later. Now, I'm going to try to show this as easy as possible. We're going to leave the bag wrong side out, so that way you can put your fabrics right sides together. First, what we're going to do is mark the center of the contrast lower panel and then also the bottom of the bag. So simply just fold your fabric in half and mark the center on the wrong side. And you'll do the same for the opposite side of the bag. Then with right sides together, you're going to match those bottom centers and clip them in place. And then what I recommend is to clip the straight edges first. So just clip a little bit more of the bottom edges together. And then we're gonna line up the rest of the side edges and clip them together. So we're creating a dome shape for our bag. And remember from before, we had stitched just a little bit. That way we could attach the zipper. And now we have just a little bit stitched so we know where we'll need to continue stitching from before and where we need to line things up still. So then you're going to start at that start-stop sewing line from before and sew all the way around and stop at that opposite start-stop line. I find it's easiest to sew this part with the flat side against the bed of the sewing machine. So you're going to position it under your machine as sew and start up in this corner here and sew around. And that way when you get to the corners and some of the more challenging parts, you can just squish the bag down as you go, and you don't have to worry about squishing the cork or the foam because it will all bounce right back into place. So you're going to sew with 3/8 inch seam allowance all the way around the side edge. And using a zipper foot or a narrow foot is really helpful for this step. So that way you can get close and maintain the seam allowance around the curves. So here's what one side will look like after you're done sewing. And make sure that you fit your hand inside the bag and feel around, and you can even unzip to see if there were any holes or spots that you missed in the seam allowance. And after you do that, then you're going to trim the entire seam allowance to 1/4 inch wide. And this will help reduce bulk when we turn the bag right side out later. And just be really careful not to cut too much away. Trimming away the foam is also helpful. So then if you unzip the zipper at all, just make sure you zip it back up. And then you'll repeat to connect the opposite side of the bag to the front and the back panels. Okay, my opposite side is sewn and trimmed, so we're ready to turn the bag right side out. So unzip the zippers all the way, and then you can turn it right side out. And use your fingers to push out the corners. And then you can also roll the seam to help the seam lay a little bit flatter. So I know you're not fooled. We're not quite done yet because we don't have any lining. But wow, I really love how this bag is turning out. I don't often keep bags for myself. Usually I just keep them for trade shows and trunk shows. but I'm loving how this one is turning out. So let's move on to the lining and finish this bag up. The next step is to assemble the lining. So take either your lining front or back. Make sure that you have the width as 10 3/4. So your piece will be taller than it is wide. So make sure you have that positioned correctly. And then also take 2 of your upper side panels, and they should have opposite curves of one another. So I've already gone ahead and marked the start-stop sewing line on the wrong side of each of my upper side panels, and you can find that on the pattern piece. And we're going to assemble the lining the exact same way as we assembled the exterior, but this time we're going to use a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And the reason why we're using a wider seam allowance is so that way our lining is just a little bit smaller and it'll fit a little bit better inside our bag. So start with the piece that has the curve on the left, and you're going to place it right sides together with the front of your lining, and you're going to align those long straight edges along the top. And I'm going to add in a few pins. And then remember, as you sew, you're going to slightly curve the upper side panel so that way the raw edges stay even on the side. And then you'll repeat for the other upper side panel. So then you'll take this over to your sewing machine and sew each side with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, just up until that start-stop sewing line. So this is what your lining piece will look like with the upper side panels attached. So you're going to flip the lining so that the wrong side is up, and make sure those upper side panels are out away from the lining piece. And you're going to press those seams open over at your iron. So make sure that both of them are flat. And then you're also going to press this entire top long edge a 1/2 inch to the wrong side, and make sure that those seams stay pressed open when you fold that 1/2 inch down. And you'll press that over at your iron as well. One notion that I love to use for this step is a Clover hot ruler, and you can iron right over this ruler and it won't melt. It's made to be used with your iron, and this is great for pressing hems or doing pockets, all sorts of things, and especially this step for the lining. So you'll place it against the wrong side, and you're simply just going to take the edge of your fabric and fold it along that 1/2 inch line. And you can adjust the ruler so that way the fold is tight, and then when you're pressing, you can just press directly over this and you'll have your perfect 1/2 inch hem along the top. So you'll do this for the front, and then you'll also repeat for the back panel and the remaining 2 upper side panels. So this is what your lining pieces should look like after pressing. And if you're worried about this fold flipping up at all while we attach the lining later on, you can do a 1/4 inch basting stitch across the top. Just make sure that you lengthen your stitch length to at least 4 millimeters. I'd recommend 5 millimeters, so that way it's easier to rip out later. But you can just stitch along the top if you would like to help hold that fold in place. So you're going to have both of your lining pieces placed like this, so they're going to be opposite of each other. And this gap in the middle will be where our zipper goes. So you'll want to have the right side face up, and you'll take both of your lower side panels and you're going to align this top straight edge with the bottom edge of each of the upper side panel pieces. And the side edges are going to be even with the side edges of the upper panels. So there will be a gap in the middle because we need to leave room for our zipper. So just make sure the sides and those bottom edges are even, and you can pin that in place. And make sure that those folds that you press stay folded, so I put a pin in each of the folds so they don't come undone. And you'll repeat to attach the opposite side. And then you're going to sew these panels together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance along the straight edge, and you'll do that for both sides. Then, after you have that seam sewn, you can press the lower side panel away from the upper side panels and top stitch a 1/4 inch from the seam. Next, we're going to attach the lining bottom piece. And again, it will be the same process as before, but this time with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So you're going to place it along one lower edge of the lining piece, and you're going to have right sides together, and you're going to sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance. After that is sewn, you'll take this opposite raw edge and you'll match it with the opposite side of your lining. So you're creating a tube. So this will be sewn here, and then you'll sew it to the bottom edge of the other side of the lining. So here's what the lining should look like so far with the bottom piece attached. And I went ahead and I top stitched each of the seams to help everything just lay nice and flat and crisp. So next, we're going to attach the side panels to the sides of the front and back of the lining. And this will be the same process as before. So I've already found the bottom center of the side panel piece, and then I've marked the bottom center of my bottom panel of the bag. So we're going to place the fabrics right sides together and match those center marks. And I recommend to pin the straight edges first, and then you're going to pin the sides starting at the top and working your way down, and then easing in the corners. And you'll do the same for this side, pinning those together, and then you'll repeat for the opposite side of the bag, matching up those center marks and doing the pinning all the way around on the right side of the bag as well. So here's what the lining looks like all pinned. And you're gonna sew each of the sides with a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around. And to make it a little bit easier on you, you can unfold this top edge temporarily. So that way this area is flat when you go to sew, and then you can start right where you stopped sewing before. And then after you go all the way around, then you can just refold it back in place. But that gives you just a little bit more room, and you're not fighting to try to get close up to those stitches from before. Also, it's a little bit easier to sew with this flat side against the bed of the sewing machine, and then the curved side face up. So we curved the fabric around these corners, so this side is now considered the curved side, and the side panels are flat. So I'd try sewing it that way, but if you want, you can sew one way and one the other to see what is easier for you. So again, you're going to sew with 1/2 inch seam allowance, and that will complete our lining. Now we're ready to assemble the bag. So for this pattern, we are doing a drop-in lining method, and that way we avoid using any bias binding. And what I recommend to use is Wonder Tape, and this is a 1/4 inch wide. This will help with our drop-in lining. So you're going to take your Wonder Tape and you're going to place it along that folded edge that we pressed earlier, and you're going to do it along the entire top edge and along the curved panels up until that bottom panel. And you'll do the same for the opposite side. So first, let's apply the double-sided tape. If you don't have any Wonder Tape for this step, that's okay. You can just use lots of pins and Wonder Clips to help hold the lining in place. The tape just really comes in handy to prevent the fabric from shifting. If you're not comfortable with sewing the lining on your sewing machine, you can always hand sew the lining in place. Just sit down with a good movie on and hand sew the lining, and it will be installed before you know it. So I'm just going to peel off one side of the paper at a time because this is very sticky. Then you're going to take your assembled exterior of your bag and you're going to place the lining inside the exterior with wrong sides together. You're going to line up those side seams from the upper side panels, all the top straight edge, and then the bottom panels should match as well. So first I'm going to match up those seams from the side panel, and when you line up the lining and position it in place, you'll want it about 1/4 inch from the edge of your zipper teeth, and that way it'll be right in line with your seam from before. So you should see some stitching on the back side of your zipper. You can't really see mine since I used the same color of thread, but you're basically going to line up your lining along that stitch line from before when you attached your zipper. And you're just going to press it down to adhere it in place. And you can use Wonder Clips or pins to hold it. I'm going to pin mine because I don't want it to shift at all. And the tape will really help hold the lining in place as well. And I'm just going to fold this kind of out of the way. I'm trying to show you the best that I can. And you're just going to pin as close as you can to the zipper. So here's what it's looking like so far. Now I'm going to pin the opposite side. So I'm just going to start with this side for now to show you. And we're going to take this over to the sewing machine and top stitch along our previous top stitching for the zipper to hold one side of the lining in place. Then we'll repeat to attach the opposite side of the lining. So to get this under my machine, I just turned part of the exterior with the wrong side out. So I just poked those corners down and just pushed them out of the way so that way I could get underneath and close to the zipper. So I'm going to lower my foot and I'm going to start at the bottom panel where my previous top stitching for the zipper begins, and I'm going to sew all along the previous top stitching. And now that we're getting closer to the opposite side, again, I'm just going to push the corners down, and that'll help the bag lay a little bit flatter so that we can go all the way to the end of the zipper. So here's what one half of the lining looks like attached to the bag. You can see it's all top stitched, so just make sure that you caught the lining all the way around. And here's what it looks like from the front. So you can't even tell where we attached the lining since we went right over our top stitching. So now we're going to attach the opposite side of the lining the exact same way, and then our bag is complete. So then we'll take this over to the sewing machine and we'll top stitch along our previous top stitching just as before. So here is what the inside of our bag looks like with the lining installed. Everything is secured down. You don't need to sew across this bottom edge here. You don't have to worry about that coming undone because stitching the lining in on the sides is enough. So then you can zip your bag closed, adjust the lining in so it lays flat. And then we're going to move on to making the crossbody strap. The final section in the instructions is to create the crossbody strap. This piece is out of our cork fabric, and we need to piece the cork to make one long strap. So to do that, you're going to place the cork fabric right sides together, perpendicular to each other. So you'll have a little bit of overlap, about 1/4 of an inch on both sides. And you're going to take this over to the sewing machine and sew a diagonal line from this upper left corner down to the lower right corner. Then you're going to take your scissors and you're going to cut about 1/4 of an inch away from the seam that you just made. And then also trim up the sides so they're even with the edges of the strap. Then you're going to finger press this seam open, and you're going to top stitch 1/8 inch on both sides of the seam. And I'm going to top stitch from the right side. So then you can trim up the thread, and by doing the top stitching, it helps add a little bit of strength to the seam and keeps the cork fabric laying flat. Now we have one long cork fabric strap. Next, we're going to fold the strap in half with wrong sides together and line up the raw edges. And you're going to top stitch with the 1/8 inch along the raw edge and also an 1/8 inch along the folded edge. So do the raw edges first so it keeps the strap folded along the entire length of the strap, and then go back and top stitch along the fold. And you can use wonder clips or some double-sided basting tape to hold this together. I'm just going to fold it and hold it as I sew. The next step after top stitching is to attach the slider buckle. So our hardware that we have left are 2 swivel hooks and 1 slider buckle. So the right side of the slider buckle should be face up. The wrong side, you can see the center bar was folded to the back, so that's considered the wrong side. So the smooth side is the right side. So have the smooth side face up and take one end of your strap and you're going to thread it through the buckle, going underneath, over the center bar, and back down. So this is what it'll look like on the front and the back. Then you're going to fold this raw end. So from the fold to the raw end measures about 1 1/4 inches. And then you're going to take this over to your sewing machine and top stitch the raw end in place with 1/8 of an inch and also 1/4 of an inch. So I usually do 2 lines of top stitching. Some people like to do a box with an X in the middle for reinforcement. It's up to you, just as long as you top stitch the end of the strap to itself. Now you're going to take the strap, so the wrong side is face up, and the wrong side is the side that you folded the strap to, so it shows the raw edge. So take your thumb and have it on the wrong side, and make sure the strap doesn't get twisted, and go all the way to the end of the strap that doesn't have any hardware on it. Then you're going to take a swivel hook, and you're going to have the hook side down, and you're going to thread it through the swivel, and you're going to slide the swivel so it's closer to the slider buckle. So just make sure that everything isn't twisted, so you should have the raw edge showing here and the swivel hook part towards the right side, like this. Okay. Then just make sure that the strap isn't twisted again. And you're going to guide the raw end through the slider buckle. And again, you're going to go from the underside back over that center bar and down the opposite side. Okay, so here's what it looks like so far. So that enclosed our raw edge, and make sure that nothing is twisted. Looks good. And then on this raw end, we can move the slider buckle out of the way a little bit more. And now we're going to add the other swivel. So now we have the buckle side up. This is the underside. And this time you're going to have the hook part towards the top, towards the right side. And then you're going to fold the raw end so it measures about 1.25 inches from the fold to the raw end. And again, you'll top stitch the end of the strap in place. So once you have that done, you can clip each of the swivel hooks to each of the D-rings on the sides of your bag, and your new purse is ready to use. I would love to see your completed project. Be sure to share your pictures and tag Sallie Tomato on social media.